Welcome to Man About Danville with Logan H. Gurman, a podcast for Danville, Kentucky and beyond. Conversations with friends, and you get to listen. Brought to you by the Logan Company, a commercial and residential real estate brokerage for Danville and Central Kentucky. 80% Danville-centric, 20% eccentric.
Good morning, Danville, Kentucky. You are listening to Danville, Kentucky's favorite podcast, Man About Danville, and I am Logan H. Gurman, the man about Danville himself. Thank you so much for joining me. Whether you are on your morning walk down in southeast Texas, whether you are mucking a horse stall in North Carolina, or whether you were going through the river and over the woods, over the river and through the woods to Grandma's house for Thanksgiving. Thanks for making this podcast a part of your journey. I say that the production staff gets me numbers on episodes, and I know when there's spring break, summer vacation, Christmas vacation, anytime people are driving, people listen to these podcasts, and I'll see spikes in numbers, and I'll see that people, I'll see old episodes get new listeners, and so I know that people are on the road listening to it, and I just want you to know I really appreciate that. If you want to keep up with all the new episodes, you can follow me on Facebook at Man About Danville, at Instagram, Man About Danville, Twitter, Man Danville. I've got a YouTube channel. I've got a website, manaboutdanville.com. You can email me, manaboutdanville@gmail.com. All those are great ways to get in touch with me. I appreciate all the reviews, all the thumbs up and likes and stars and all that stuff. So I appreciate that. I am pleased to be joined by my friend, gentleman, man about town, scholar, author. What else do you do?
That's about it.
Okay, just those 15 things. Stuart Sanders. Stuart, thank you for being with me this morning.
Well, thanks for having me.
You were on, you're a repeat guest. I've got so many of these done now that we've got some repeat guests. You were on earlier this year, actually. I didn't even realize it was this year, but discussing some other projects. But I told you, please come back on when you release a new book, and your new book is out.
It is.
Tell me the title and all about it.
It's called Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence is the name of it. And so it's mainly about a duel that was fought in Kentucky in 1862 between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. So these two guys ended up fighting a formal affair of honor up near Maysville, Kentucky, using rifles at 60 yards. And the duel sort of had its roots in the Civil War and the Secession crisis and things like that.
Did you say it was 1862?
Correct.
So it was during the Civil War? It
was during the Civil War, early on.
They couldn't get enough on the battlefield, so they decided to just take it to the out to the parking lot. But not the parking lot. Where did these two?
So they actually dueled in Dover, Kentucky, which is in Bracken County, so really close to Maysville, and they fought at a place called the Fishing Shore, which is basically like a clear spot on the Ohio River. So they were sort of near the bank of the Ohio River.
And from what I understand, and most of my understanding of duels comes from you, a lot of times they tried to do this in quasi-legal areas where it was difficult to define jurisdiction, county lines.
Right. Yeah, that was very typical. So I think I mentioned this last time. There were I think 5 duels fought at what is now the Kentucky Horse Park, which is on the border of Scott and Fayette counties. And there was a farm owned by a guy named James K. Duke, who's sort of a wealthy landowner up there, and his farm was used quite a bit for affairs of honor because the prosecutors couldn't find jurisdiction on who should try the case. So a lot of times they fought on county lines.
Now, the horse track there at the Kentucky-Tennessee line on 65 is the dueling grounds.
Right.
Is that historically accurate?
It is, because that was also sort of another larger dueling area. Sam Houston fought a duel there, actually. Andrew Jackson fought a famous duel there with a guy named Dickinson. And actually, Jackson killed Dickinson there. So this was before he was elected president. So, one thing the book looks at is how did these upper class, Kentuckians and Southerners who wanted political careers, dueling did not affect their careers at all. In a sense, it sort of enhanced it. Henry Clay, for example, fought at least 2 duels. Once when he was a state legislator, and the second one when he was Secretary of State. So, you have the man who was eventually known as the Great Compromiser, who ends up fighting two duels, including one when he was in office.
That's amazing. I can imagine Madeleine Albright or Blinken.
Right. Yeah, and it's pretty crazy. I mean, I think it was 1809. I think was his first duel with a guy named Humphrey Marshall, and tensions were sort of high with Great Britain at the time. It was before the War of 1812, and Clay had done a proposal that Kentuckians should only wear clothing that was made in America. And Humphrey Marshall called this the claptrap of a demagogue, which is a great line. Of course, Clay takes insult at this and then issues a challenge, and Marshall accepts. So they fought near Louisville with pistols at 10 paces. And I think Clay was sort of lightly wounded as a result of that scrap. But, then he fought later in life, and, there were always rumors swirling around him that he and Andrew Jackson would fight too.
So Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, President of the United States,
right.
Tennessean, fought in a duel, got to be president, could not have been governor of Kentucky.
Correct. Yeah, because there's the oath that started in the 1850 Constitution. And, if you know attorneys or even, if you're on the board of a library, one of the county library appointees, you have to actually swear that oath that you've not, I've neither participated in a duel nor acted as a second, which I think is great. And so, the line always gets a chuckle from audiences, of course, rightly so. But it's nice that we keep that sort of bit of history in there. And the reason is because the legislature at the time was really trying to discourage dueling among upper classes. And so they figured that, a man's ambition would sort of outweigh his desire to duel. Actually, in the researching the book, I found this list of Kentuckians who signed an oath and a pledge saying, I will not fight a duel, except one guy sort of wrote, I will not do this except under very extreme circumstances.
Unless I really, really need to.
Right, unless I really need to shoot a guy. And so, giving himself sort of an out on that. But even there was a guy named James Trotter who signed it, and he ended up fighting a duel several years later. So again, like this sort of honor culture that existed in Kentucky and the need to defend one's, reputation, your sort of manhood, and to kind of, prevent yourself from being shamed in a community drove a lot of these guys to the dueling ground.
Is it true that you own a pair of 19th century dueling pistols, matched flintlocks?
I do not. I wish I did. So if anyone wants to give me a pair.
Does the museum have any?
Oh, yeah, we've got plenty. I work for the Kentucky Historical Society, and we've got the State History Museum in Frankfort, and we own several, actually, yeah.
I was poking around on the Instagram, and there's an antique shop in London that I follow, of course. What else you got to follow? That's right. What Instagram's for, following antique shops in London. But they had a match set of really attractive, beautiful, ancient dueling. And I think they were 30,000 pounds for the pair.
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't take my offer. But anyway, they were pretty cool looking.
Yeah, and that, it points to sort of the culture of the time, too, which I think is pretty interesting. Because, a gentleman, would have their own sort of this finely crafted matching set, and a lot of them were made in England. So duels were typically fought with pistols at 10 paces, which would be about 30 feet. And however, it was up to whoever had been challenged to pick the weapon. So in the book I've got, they actually, it was fought during the Civil War. They actually used what was called a Colt revolving rifle loaded with one round. And they fought at 60 yards with that. So there were several Kentucky duels that were used with rifles. It just depended on what your expertise was in.
It could be a sword or a knife, too.
Yeah, it could be a sword or a knife. And there's one story about a blacksmith who was challenged, and he supposedly picked hammers. And I don't think the duel ever took place. Somebody wisely deferred from that. But, really ran the gamut. But typically, pistols were used more often than not.
All right, speaking of knife fighting and famous Kentuckians, George Chin's father.
Yeah.
Did he ever? He was a renowned knife fighter.
Yeah.
Was he ever in any duels?
I don't think he was ever in a formal duel. He had sort of more kind of informal scraps after the Civil War. Because, dueling sort of went out of fashion in the years after the Civil War. That it kind of sputtered a few times. There were a few more that were fought in Kentucky after the war. But, Jack Chin was his name. And he was actually a teenager during the Civil War. So he sort of came along a generation too late. So he grew up at a time in Kentucky where kind of upper-class, elite Kentuckians would instead sort of just draw a pistol and start shooting if they had a problem with somebody. And so he avoided the whole dueling thing.
George Chin from our neighboring county over there in Harrisburg, Mercer County, that's a fascinating guy. I think your press wrote a book on him that I read that's a whole podcast episode right there. So what prompted you to go down this rabbit hole with the book you just wrote?
Well, I'd written several books about the Civil War earlier, and had had kind of known about this story, and I've always been sort of fascinated by duels, but the fact that these two guys, again, one a Union colonel, one a pro-Confederate civilian, kind of transformed the dueling ground into their own personal battlefield. And sort of the idea that two men, while Americans were slaughtering each other in droves on battlefields across the country, these guys take the time to actually do negotiations and have a challenged, drawn-out fight with rifles on the shore of the Ohio River just seems sort of crazy to me. So I wanted to sort of examine that a lot more. And when I found out, the duel really had its roost in the secession crisis because the civilian, whose name was William Casto, was a lawyer from Maysville. He'd been arrested by Union authorities for being pro-Confederate. And typically what they would do in Kentucky, Union authorities would arrest pro-Confederate civilians, would sort of send them to Union prison camps for a few months. It was almost like shock probation, try to skip, the scared straight program almost. And most of the guys would typically, sign an oath of allegiance saying, I'll never support the Confederacy again, because they were under the threat of imprisonment or death if they violated that oath. But this guy refused to sign. He just sort of stewed in prison for a few months. They finally just kind of threw him out. And he went back to Maysville, and he ended up challenging Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalf to duel because Metcalf was the guy who'd actually arrested him.
Nobody names their kid Leonidas anymore.
Yeah, I know. It's a real shame.
Was there a Leonidas at the Battle of Perryville?
Yeah, Leonidas Polk, who was second in command of the Confederate Army. Yeah, so
the Rolodex of my mind was mysterious. Wait, that's two Leonidases.
Yeah, two Leonidases you know of at least. But yeah, he was known as the Bishop General, Leonidas Polk, and he was involved with Swanee. Before he got killed during the war, got killed by an artillery shell, actually.
All right, so I'm sorry, I interrupted. Back to the other Leonidas.
Yeah, but so Leonidas Metcalf, he was the son of a Kentucky governor, Thomas Metcalf, who's known as Old Stonehammer, and who'd been a Mason. He was a Mason before he was governor. And Governor Metcalf had actually been involved in a couple of duels too when he was in Congress, I believe. And so it was sort of a family tradition, I guess, to take a pot shot at somebody else. But the civilian was so angry over his arrest, he ended up challenging Metcalf. And according to the convention at the time, Metcalf probably didn't have to duel, but he went to a guy named Thomas Marshall Green, who was a newspaper editor in Maysville, and sort of asked him for advice. And this is a great Danville connection to the book. Green was actually born at Waveland, the house, I guess off Houstonville Road now, sort of near Calvary Baptist Church, the one big historic house that's back there in that area. And the Greens were very prominent in Danville at the time, and he'd gone to Center, had become an attorney, but he had actually challenged a guy to duel, so he lost his law license. And so then he became a newspaper editor. And he ended up sort of helping Metcalf negotiate the duel. And they ended up fighting it in May of 1862, again with rifles at 60 yards on the banks of the Ohio River. And one man ended up getting killed in the action.
So what was the aftermath of all this? Other than the one fellow not making it.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of cast a pall over the community, I think. I mean, it was, but it really, demonstrated how prevalent violence was, during the Civil War, and how, civilians were even willing to sort of, over political reasons, kind of, fight a duel or commit murder as a result of, these political allegiances.
Were there any arrests in the Danville area during the secession crisis? Yeah,
just as William Casto had been arrested in Maysville, there were actually arrests in this area too. And in Harrodsburg, for example, there were actually 3 legislators who were arrested. They were on their way supposedly south. Local Home Guard units, including some guys from Danville, they were sort of like a state militia, were paranoid at the time of all these Kentuckians who were traveling south to join the Confederacy. And they ended up arresting these 3 legislators in Harrodsburg, threw them in jail. And, typically the legislature had been pretty quiet about civilian arrests during the early part of the war. But then when 3 of their own got, thrown in the hoosegow, that sort of changed things. And there was a committee that was sent down to sort of investigate what had happened. And the 3 guys were eventually set free. It turns out they were probably pro-Confederate. A couple of them ended up serving in, the Confederate legislature later and things like that. So, there were local ramifications of all these arrests that were going on. Danville was pretty interesting. I mean, it was primarily a Unionist community, like a very strong Unionist community. So there wasn't a lot of kind of very vocal secessionist activity. So I haven't found any arrests that actually took place here, but Harrodsburg would have been the closest spot.
Was there much dueling that went on in Danville?
A little bit. I found a couple of instances. There was one that was fought on the Dix River before the war. I think I mentioned in the last episode in more detail, but basically there were two brothers-in-law who ended up having a duel. Evidently, the brother of the wife was not happy with how his brother-in-law was treating his sister, and they ended up fighting a duel on an island in the Dix River. The guy killed his brother-in-law and then ended up going to Missouri to sort of flee prosecution at that time. And the dead man is actually buried, the victim of the duel is buried in the Presbyterian churchyard in that area there, yeah.
Danville, you say, was a pretty pro-union community, although I know there was a dissenting opinion
right.
In the community. What was Danville like during the Civil War, maybe on the eve of the Battle of Perryville?
Yeah, early on, as I mentioned, it was a very unionist community early on. So there were a lot of union rallies that took place in town. So like on George Washington's birthday, February of 1861, for example, there were a lot of rallies and public parades and, a lot of flag waving at that time because Danville residents, were very attuned to unionism and wanted the nation to stay together at that time. That sort of carried over when the war finally erupted.
Did that mean they were anti-slavery too?
No, not at all.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That's what to me. That's what's so interesting about Kentucky. I mean, you have so many of these pro-unionists who are also pro-slavery. And at the time, in 1860, about 20% of Kentucky's population were slaves, and even a lot of times, even if you didn't own a slave, you sort of aspired to ownership.
Jeez.
Yeah, and the other thing,
when you say that out loud, it just seems so.
Oh, it's crazy, and that's how it was. And the other thing too, a lot of people will say, "Well, my great-great-grandfather didn't own slaves, so he didn't support the institution." However, Danville's a great example of that because in I think it was the 1840s or 1850s, Jeremiah Boyle, who was a local lawyer, was actually speaking at an emancipation rally and talked about how great it was in Danville because so many enslaved people had been trained as craftsmen. And so you had painters, you had tinsmiths, you had wallpaper hangers, you had masons. I mean, the list of sort of trades that slaves had been trained in goes on and on. So the practice of leasing out slaves was very frequent. So you may not have the financial means to actually own another human being, but you could rent one while you were having a house built.
Jeez.
So, yeah. So, I mean, everybody was affected by that. And sort of the leasing and renting of slaves was very common in this area. Kentucky was pro-slavery, but it was also pro-union. And this is what's so interesting to me. Because we're a border state, there were free states just north of us. There were fugitive slave laws that were enacted in the 1850s primarily, where if your enslaved person ran away, up north they would be forced to sort of return him to authorities and bring him back to you. And a lot of Kentuckians feared that if Kentucky seceded from the Union, Kentucky would be a separate nation at that point, part of the Confederacy, and all the fugitive slave laws would just fall apart. So if you're, being so close to freedom, if a slave here escaped across the Ohio River to Indiana, if Kentucky were part of the Confederacy, then there was no way to force them back. So a lot of Kentucky unionism was based also on pro-slavery and wanting these protections from the federal government. So that for Kentuckians, slavery was better protected under the U.S. Constitution than out of it.
That's I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have all these. And then the Emancipation Proclamation sort of changed everything. And so after that, you have a lot of Kentucky Union officers who end up resigning their commissions as a result. So my great-great-grandfather, he was an 1848 center grad. He'd become a doctor. He was a Union surgeon in the 27th Kentucky Infantry. He ended up resigning his commission shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation. And he claimed that it was over, personal. He needed to attend to personal business. But in family genealogy that his son wrote, he talks about, Dad resigned after the Emancipation Proclamation because they wanted to see slavery protected. And so when they saw the war aims changing to become, a war of liberating slaves, a lot of Kentuckians were angry about that and left the Army.
Huh. I'd never heard that analysis of it before.
Yeah, and it's wild. I mean, during that time, you have Union Colonel Frank Wolford giving speeches. He was an attorney from Casey County. Especially they were angered by the enlistment of African Americans into the Union Army at Camp Nelson because seeing a black man in uniform armed was sort of tantamount to slave rebellion. And they were really fearful of that throughout Kentucky history. But Wolford gave all these speeches condemning the Lincoln administration. He was actually arrested, put in jail over that. You also have the state's then lieutenant governor, his last name was Jacob. He ended up getting arrested and sent to Richmond, Virginia. Like basically, even though he'd been a Union colonel, was exiled. Richard T. Jacob was exiled to Richmond And so he's writing Lincoln these letters like, look, I was a Union soldier, but you've exiled me to the Confederate capital. And so it's just, all these Kentuckians who got sort of swept up in condemning the Lincoln administration for Emancipation Proclamation, then also the enlistment of black troops, really suffered a lot of consequences. And, in the eyes of a lot of Unionists, rightfully so.
Well, that's an interesting twist on it that I never really considered. So your day job, you work at the Kentucky History Museum.
Correct.
Is that the right title?
Kentucky Historical Society.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What's new and exciting up there?
Gosh, a lot. We just had a Civil War Day, actually, which we're going to start doing annually every October. And so we have a lot of speakers come in. We have an exhibit that's fairly new. It's on called Our Stories, Our Service. It's on Kentucky women's veterans. And so it's a great overview of sort of experiences of Kentucky women veterans.
And not just Civil War veterans.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
From every era.
From every era, yeah. And so it's really great. Some wonderful artifacts up there, including a lot that have been loaned to us from more modern veterans. And it's been just, we've had a couple of receptions with female veterans that have, it's been a very emotional experience for them. Because it's great to sort of, recognize their service to the country.
Like some women veterans who've been coming in from out of state or?
Well, it's mainly in state,
okay.
Yeah. But it's I don't know, it's been really moving. I mean, getting a chance to meet them and talk about their stories has been really a highlight of my career there, to be honest.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Do you all do anything exciting for the holidays up there? You all dress up in Victorian costume and go caroling or anything?
We do not, luckily. No one wants to hear us singing.
You don't put on Lincoln's cufflinks or?
Henry Clay's cufflinks, and then we carry around Lincoln's watch. But no, but there's a lot of activity during the holidays. And throughout the year, we've got different. If people go to our website, which is history.ky.gov, you can get an overview of everything that we do.
I tell you, I've been in the facility. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it's great.
When I was a third grader, I went to the old state capitol.
Right.
And I think maybe we went to the old Kentucky Arsenal.
Yeah, it's now the Kentucky Military History Museum, and we manage that. We manage the old state capitol, and that's a great space too. I mean, it's we have one of the honestly finest firearms collections of any museum in the country. We have an encyclopedic collection of 20th century firearms in particular.
Is that due in some part to George Chin?
It is. It's an interesting story.
That man loved guns.
Yeah, and he's from Harrisburg. He'd been a former Marine and a weapons inventor. He'd invented the fully automatic grenade launcher, for example, and a couple of other things. And he was director of the Kentucky Historical Society in the 70s. I think I've got the story right. They were gonna put a National Firearms Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C., but after Vietnam, there sort of wasn't the political stomach to do that, and that fell through. But they'd already collected a lot of weapons, and so Colonel Chin actually had that all those weapons sent to us at the Kentucky Historical Society. So now we've got this incredible collection. I mean, you name a firearm, we've probably got it.
Huh.
Yeah, from the Swedish K submachine gun to a great collection of World War II stuff. I mean, it really runs the gamut.
And I'm guessing a Kentucky long rifle?
Yeah, we've got actually a bunch of long rifles that are great. And, there's one of Boone's relatives. We've got a great one from him. We have William Whitley's rifle that used to be part of the Kentucky Department of Parks. We sort of stored that for them for a number of years, and they've sort of transferred that over to us last year, which is great. So we send that down to the William Whitley house at least once a year to be on display down there in Lincoln County. So it's an incredible firearms collection.
Well, the main space of the Kentucky Historical Society, that's a fabulous building and library and exhibition space and everything else.
Yeah, and we're really a research center. We've got an incredible library and archive too, and if any listeners are interested in genealogy, it's a really great place to start exploring your own Kentucky roots, because we've got staff on hand who can help, and again, this wonderful research library and archive that is used by, I think I mentioned this last time, it's used by researchers from all over the world. We have a woman in now who's with the University of Warwick in England who's researching sort of antebellum, what was it? But basically slavery in antebellum United States. So pretty interesting stuff. Have
you done a lot of genealogy work on your own family?
A bit. I was lucky. My great-grandfather ended up spending 50 years doing it on my dad's side. So a lot of that has been done. But I'm got a lot of Kentucky roots to go, very deep. So
I've had some relatives that have done extensive work in it. I just haven't, and they have been good enough to write it all down and save it. And, and I've got copies of it. I've just never really gotten into it that deeply.
Well, and now with online resources like Ancestry.com, I mean, it's so much is at your fingertips. What would have taken hours and hours and hours to do before by having to drive to a library and look at microfilm. I mean, now you type a name into your computer and it pops, all the census information pops up, for example.
And then the 23andMe and all those things too.
Yeah. And that's fascinating. So we do a couple of, we have a genealogy programs throughout the year, and I think we'll be doing more on DNA this year probably.
I don't know that I'm ready to ship off a blood sample.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of.
There's some things I don't want to know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And each company's a little bit different. So my uncle did one, and it took it way, way back. I mean, basically to the Saxons. I mean, it said 70 generations back you have this. I mean, so some of it's pretty incredible. They show genetic markers, and then a lot of it won't. It's so early it won't match up with sort of known family trees, which I think is pretty fascinating too. Yeah, like I had Scandinavian, which in the family tree there's none of that. It was probably Vikings going to Scotland at some point.
Yeah.
But, so it's pretty wild.
So what was Danville and Boyle County like at the precipice of the Civil War, say before the Battle of Perryville?
Yeah, before Perryville it was interesting. So at that point, the war had not really touched Danville too grievously at that time. There'd been a lot of kind of soldiers' activities moving in and out of town. One interesting episode that I think most people don't know about was early in the war. There's a camp established in near Bryantsville called Camp Dick Robinson, and the house still stands. While you're driving to Lexington, it's behind a BP station now. It's near Camp Dick Elementary School, and that was the home of Richard Robinson. He was a local Unionist who basically offered up that property to become a large Union recruiting ground, and because there was a presence of Union troops there, Union refugees from East Tennessee sort of made their way up to enlist in the Union Army there. And so East Tennessee was under Confederate occupation. These Unionist refugees were really suffering. They sort of marched up to this area. And when they got to Danville, they ended up going to what is now Constitution Square. It was then the Danville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And Unionist Danville residents sort of gathered and had a massive picnic for all these, hundreds of refugees. And it made national headlines all over the country. And that sort of, showed that Danville was this like very strong Unionist community. So the community kind of came together, even though there were pro-Confederate Danville residents who sort of left town to join the Confederate Army. There's a lot of support for the Union cause in Danville at that time and during the secession crisis. You also had a lot of guys, joining the Union Army, like the 4th Kentucky Infantry Regiment, which is a Union regiment, was commanded by a local attorney named Speed Smith Fry, and they ended up sort of fighting the Battle of Mill Springs. It was fought in January of 1862 down near Somerset, and Fry was sort of considered a hero of that battle because he supposedly killed a Confederate general named Felix Zollicoffer. But the 4th Kentucky fought along this fence row there, suffered a lot of casualties, and sort of emerged as kind of one of the heroic regiments of that battle, which was an very important early victory in the war. And so by the time Perryville rolled around in October of 1862, you had Danville residents fighting elsewhere, but the town had not really been touched by the war at that point.
So is that Fry an ancestor of the current Danville Frys?
Probably not. The spelling's different, but I'm not sure. He was Fry, and he had sort of an interesting career too. I mean, he ended up then was put in charge of Camp Dick Robinson later and issued this sort of terrible order, basically evicting former slaves who'd gathered outside of the camp one winter, and a lot actually froze to death. So he has a terrible mark on his career. But he was in town for years after the battle. He sort of this kind of when he was a soldier sleeping on the ground one night, some sort of insect crawled into his ear and like made him deaf in one ear. So he's sort of this old bearded deaf guy who's in town after the war, but was an attorney and a business owner, and again was kind of considered this hero of the Battle of Mill Springs.
Huh. You're just chock full of good stories, Stuart.
Chock full of happy stories.
Bugs crawling in ears.
Yeah, aftermaths of battles, of duels, and all sorts of stuff.
Freezing to death.
Yeah, happy stuff.
All right, so give me the title of your new book again.
Called Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. And sort of the latter part of the book looks at how violence changed in Kentucky after the Civil War. So dueling went away, and among upper classes, sort of spontaneous violence became more of a thing. So it kind of, again, looks at all the secession crisis and how violence and conflict changed through the lens of that duel that was fought in 1862.
We talk about how partisan politics is now, but
Yeah.
at least we're not challenging one congressman versus another
Right.
to take it out back with firearms.
Yeah. And it was, We have divisions now, of course, but, I don't think it was anything like it was right before the Civil War.
No, they were literally shooting at each other.
literally shooting at each other.
All right. I can get your book on Amazon.
Yep, it's available online and in bookstores now too. So,
is there there's some bookstores in town where I can find it?
Hopefully, I haven't checked yet. It literally just came out a couple weeks ago. But typically, the gift shop Constitution Square has carried my books before. The Hub has too. So, Perryville Battlefield has some of mine. So hopefully, this book will be at those places fairly soon too. I hope.
All right. If I had any technical wherewithal, I may get my production manager Julian on this.
Yeah.
I need to have an Amazon affiliate link. It would be handy if you could just click through my show notes, and then you would sell a book, and I would make an enormous amount of profit off each copy sold.
I mean, you have a lot of interns just sitting around here not doing much, so it'd be nice if
they're getting ready for exams on campus, and I don't want to overwork them here before the holidays.
I do appreciate the swag bag they gave me though, with Rolex watch, and it's very, very nice.
For a two-time guest, we really pull out
Right.
all the stops. All right. Any other news you want to share with us, Stuart?
I think I'm good.
All right, man.
I appreciate you having me.
Well, thanks for coming. You're always welcome. You'd be a good guest host, kind of a Joan Rivers type when Johnny Carson.
Anytime.
Anytime you want to bring a guest on, let me know.
Yeah, I'll bring some of my history nerd friends on too.
Here, let's give a shout out to our other friends, Brian Wofford and Harold Edwards. What's the name of their podcast? Is it Uncommon History of the South?
Uncommon History, yeah.
They do. You've been on that podcast, and they do a great. They do some really interesting stuff over there too.
Yeah, and they both really know the county history well. And
Harold's chock full of good stories, some of which he doesn't tell to public audiences. But anyway, all right, Stuart, thanks for being with me.
Thanks, Logan. Appreciate it.
Once again, my special thanks to my guest, Stuart Sanders. Do you want to get in touch with me to talk about the show or real estate? You can email me at manaboutdanville@gmail.com. You can find me on my website, manaboutdanville.com. Follow me on Instagram at manaboutdanville. The Twitter handle is at mandanville. And, of course, there's a Facebook page, Man About Danville. I'm also now on the YouTube, so you can listen to these episodes and have a nice static photo of my picture on your television set while you're watching it. I'm on Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, anywhere else you find your podcast. You could even use your Amazon Echo device and say, hey, Alexa, listen to the Man About Danville podcast. If you have a moment, hit subscribe, give me a review. I appreciate all that stuff. Until next time, be well, have a good weekend, and thanks for listening.
That's it. We're out. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Subscribe to Man About Danville wherever you access your favorite podcasts, and be sure to tell your friends about us. You've been listening to Man About Danville with Logan H. Gurman, brought to you by the Logan Company, a commercial and residential real estate brokerage for Danville and Central Kentucky. Know someone who would be a good guest? Want to be a guest yourself? Have an idea for the show? Get in touch with us. Find all our contact information on the web at manaboutdanville.com. Thanks for joining us.